They say revolutions must roar, so you will imagine fire, guns, blood in the streets. But what if I told you about a revolution that was not led by tanks or bullets, but by words, courage, and moral clarity? That's the story of Václav Havel and how one man's peaceful leadership helped bring down a regime without rewriting the world in violence. Czechoslovakia, autumn 1989. 40 years under a rigid communist regime. Secret police everywhere. Self-censorship the norm. People felt it in their bones something was wrong. A sense of heaviness, of words losing meaning, of hope stifled. But change hadn't yet broken through. Václav Havel was already living on the margins. Playwright. Dissident. Someone who wrote essays like The Power of the Powerless, criticizing the system not with guns but by exposing its absurdities. He had been arrested, harassed, watched. He was not a frontline politician in the usual sense. Rather, he was a moral witness. Then came November 17, 1989. A student demonstration in Prague, meant to commemorate something else, the anniversary of a student protest crushed decades earlier. What started as officially approved took on a life of its own. Students marched. Then they shouted. Then the police cracked down brutally on peaceful youth and silenced voices. That crackdown was the spark. It lit the tinder among a people long suppressed. Overnight, the protests grew. Across cities where factories worked under state slogans, where people queued for basics, where speech was monitored. The marchers weren't just students. Workers, intellectuals, and families joined in. Streets that had been quiet with fear were filled with voices. In those early days, when violence threatened and rhetoric of repression echoed, Havel did not lead with anger or weapons. He led with words, with moral clarity, with a refusal to compromise on the principle that change must be peaceful. He became part of Civic Forum, a coalition of opposition groups demanding free elections, and to one-party rule, restoration of rights. Even as crowds swelled tens of thousands. Then hundreds of thousands, Havel resisted calls to turn to force. Why? Because in his view, violence would legitimize the regime's worst fears, betray the moral strength of the people, and possibly plunge the country into chaos. He believed that if the people held their ground without bloodshed, the world would see, the regime would waver, and power could be transferred without massacre. He stood on a balcony in Prague and addressed the masses. Not as a general, but as a citizen, asking his brethren to rise, but rise with dignity. To protest but not to destroy. To demand truth and respect but not to lose themselves to hatred. His speeches combined poetic understatement with moral insistence. They appealed to conscience. Many listened. Many cried. Many dared, for the first time, to hope. Havel's past gave him credibility. He had spent years in the dissident underground. He had been imprisoned. He had written critical essays and plays that mocked the absurd logic of totalitarian rule. So when he asked people to remain nonviolent but firm, they believed him because he had lived that risk. Protests continued every day. The regime was unsure. Should they crack down harder? Should they send in the army? The people were chanting, rattling keys, waving banners. Workers joined in with strikes. People from every walk of life exposed how fragile the system was. The internal monologues of dissidents were filled with fear. Will this just be another failed cry? If the army turns, what happens to all of us? Meanwhile, international news began talking about what was happening in Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union was under Gorbachev, reforming. Eastern Europe was shifting. The Berlin Wall itself had fallen. But still, uncertainty and fear loomed. The regime tried to negotiate, to divide, to threaten, stop or face consequences. At the same time, they watched as their ability to repress crumbled. The public refused to be cowed. The church spoke up. Intellectuals, artists, and even some within the regime quietly signaled that things must change. All of this was held together by one demand: peaceful, not violent, truthful, not deceptive, legitimate change, not a coup. Civic Forum became the public face of that demand. Havel became its symbol not because he wanted power, but because he embodied the idea that dignity and truth matter. November 27, 1989. A general strike swept across the country. Schools, factories, and hospitals shut down. Millions of people silently or not so silently refused to work. The press struggled. The regime couldn't maintain control. It wasn't just protests now, it was societal refusal. This strike was a signal. This was real. The regime had to decide. Would they use force? Would they compromise? Or would they collapse? Negotiations began. It seemed improbable that rulers, used to repressing, would negotiate with dissidents. But since the protests and solidarity were massive, and because the regime feared both internal decay and external pressure, they had little choice. Havel was in many ways safe. He was known, he was respected abroad, and he was morally grounded. To kill or violently suppress now would risk international condemnation or worse, chaos. The people pressed forward. Then, very quietly, almost without fanfare, power began to shift. On December 10, President Gustav Husak resigned. The Communist Party abandoned its monopoly. Laws were changed. Civic Forum members assumed roles in the transition. And by December 29, 1989, Václav Havel was elected president of Czechoslovakia not by a violent overthrow, but by a democratic transition. A writer became president. A dissident's moral leadership became the law of the land. What made this possible? Havel's leadership offers powerful lessons. He had moral authority before political power. He had earned trust through his writing, his commitment, and his suffering. He didn't wait for the moment, he shaped it. People believed him. He also practiced patience and restraint. He could have stoked anger, called for uprising, but he repeatedly asked people to remain peaceful. Once violence enters, the regime's narrative shifts, and the cost becomes human lives. By holding off violence, he kept the upper hand. He used institutions and symbols effectively. Civic Forum was a structure people could rally around. The commemoration of suppressed student protests tied the present struggle to a shared memory. Public spaces like Wenceslas Square became stages of conscience, not battlefields. The movement was brought students, workers, intellectuals, families, people who had long given up hope all came out. When whole factories and hospitals went on strike, the economic pressure became real. When the public refused to obey, the regime's power was revealed as fragile. And finally, the authorities feared escalation. Seeing how massive, unified, and non-violent the protests were, they recognized that violent repression would backfire. International attention was intense. The Soviet bloc was changing. Havel's leadership ensured that. The movement looked peaceful, dignified, and morally superior. That clarity left the regime with no safe option but to yield. Once Havel became president, the real work began, rebuilding a society after decades of suppression. He lifted censorship, released political prisoners, allowed free speech, opened borders, and began democratic elections. It wasn't easy. There were divisions, skeptics, and disappointments. Change takes time. Morality doesn't easily translate into policy. Havel himself admitted that being a dissident was different from being a leader. But still, the core transformation had happened. The regime no longer ruled through fear. The people had reclaimed their voice. Imagine standing in Wenceslas Square the evening of November 20th to 21st, 1989. Tens of thousands of people. A cold wind. Lamps on old buildings casting long shadows. The crowd chanting. Communist symbols hanging limply. The state wavering, waiting. And then, as dawn breaks, the realization, the impossible is happening. No tanks rolling in. No bloodshed. Just people standing up. Václav Havel looked out, not as an angry rebel, but as someone who believed in truth and love. Someone who believed it was possible to uproot oppression with words, with peaceful presence, with courage that didn't need a rifle. That's the haunting power of the Velvet Revolution. It shows that peaceful leadership is not weakness, it is a different kind of strength. It demands humility, clarity, and courage. It believes ordinary citizens matter. It believes truth matters. It reminds us that the legitimacy of power comes from moral ground, not brute force. So what can we take away from Václav Havel's example? Even in hopeless situations, ethical leadership matters. When someone stands for truth and dignity, people notice. Peace isn't passive. Nonviolence takes strength to restrain wrath, to persist when provoked. Big change often starts small: a student protest, a suppressed essay, a voice in the dark that says, "We deserve better." True leadership listens, connects, builds trust, and acts with integrity, not just for power, but for principle. If you believe stories like this matter, that change without blood is possible, then carry that idea into your life. Stand up where injustice is, even if it's just with words. Refuse to accept what is wrong. Build the good where you can. If you like this story, comment your thoughts. What surprised you? What questions do you have about peaceful resistance or moral leadership? Share this video so more people know about Havel's quiet revolution. And if you're new here, hit subscribe for more real stories like this. Because sometimes, the loudest revolutions are the ones that speak quietly.